if you know for sure that's who it is, and then introduce our speaker. And I hope everyone's having a good time. If you need to stretch your legs right now, it's time to do it because Mark's talking. So if you need to get up and stretch right now, it's time to do it. Thank you, boss.
Yeah. There's a swap. Dr. Stuart Bennett's going to be here next month. I believe he's going to be talking about the Atlanta campaign. He was supposed to be here tonight, but I guess he's awful busy man. I first met Dr. Fields at the Shiloh reenactment anniversary. It was a little not disorganized, besides rainy and muddy. We were just in a big tent. General Beauregard spoke, standing around, no microphone, no nothing. Came General Grant's turn. He said he's not going to have any of this, and he jumped up on the table. And gave his presentation. I sat down in front of him, and everything he said, I was going like this, disagreed. Well, that was the kind of spirit the man has to jump up on the table and give his presentation. But I assured him tonight, and I hope they wouldn't be doing that tonight, that we had a podium for him. But Dr. Grant has his bachelor's and master's for the University of Memphis, but it's Memphis State to us. He has a master's and his PhD from the Michigan State University. He's a career educator, having taught school 8 years, and then 25 years as a high school administrator. He is now an education consultant and associate professor at Belhaven University and the University of Memphis. So it now falls on me at this time to introduce that low-down, tobacco-chewing, whiskey-drinking, thief, house-burning scoundrel, General Ulysses S. Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. It is good that we can come together like this and spend time together in fellowship and brotherhood and to learn about our past so that we may go into our future with the knowledge of where we've been, and hopefully we don't make the same mistakes. Tonight I'm going to talk to you and tell you a little bit about me, but I beg your indulgence because to use the personal pronoun I is anathema to me, and I do not care to use it. But given the circumstances, I am going to have to use the pronoun I several times, and I do beg your indulgence. I'm going to tell you about myself, possibly some information you don't have, so you can get to know who I am beyond the pages of the history books. And then, time permitting, I'm going to talk to you about the Mississippi campaign leading up to Vicksburg. Now, I was born in April of 1822 on the banks of the Ohio River at Point Pleasant, Ohio. My father shortly moved thereafter to Georgetown, Ohio, where I essentially grew up. I was the firstborn of 7 children. My father often bragged about me to his friends and said, that boy is going to be something someday. And his friends all laughed behind his back because I never talked. They all thought that I was defective mentally. And when my father, Jesse Root Grant, would leave the meeting that he was at, or the gathering, they would all laugh, slap their knee, and say, that boy ain't going to do nothing. My feeling was, if you don't have anything to say, don't say anything. So I didn't talk much. I was 6 weeks old before I had a name. My mother, Hannah Simpson, a very austere and taciturn lady, who one person described it was possible for somebody in the Methodist Church to be a saint, she would have been sainted. Very stern lady. And my father, Jesse Root Grant, couldn't make up their mind what to name me. So I was 6 weeks old, taken to a family gathering, and everybody wrote names on slips of paper and put them in a hat. My name was selected out of a hat. Now, I was named Hiram Ulysses Grant. My father liked Ulysses because my father, Jesse Root Grant, fancied himself a classically educated and very skilled public speaker. And his brother wanted Hiram because it was a strong and biblical name. My father liked Ulysses from the classics, so I was named Hiram Ulysses Grant. I grew up being called Ulyss or Liss. My family called me Liss. My not family called me Useless. You can see how easily Ulysses transferred to useless, and I became accustomed to that. I was a very capable youngster, something of a horse master. At age 9, I was breaking horses that farmers would bring from other parts of the country, the region around our home in Georgetown, and I was breaking recalcitrant horses. My father would send me into towns 20, 25 miles distance on a flatbed wagon at age 10. I'd be gone from early morning to well into the night. Very capable and industrious young man. There was nothing wrong with my intellect, I don't think. I've done fairly well. I just didn't have anything to say. At about age 17, I had a pretty good education, some boarding school in nearby towns, and some good teachers. My father came home to dinner one evening, and he sat down at the table, and I'm eating my dinner, and he said, "Well, Ulyss, I think you've got it." Of course, I threw a mouthful of food. I said, "Got what?" He said, "Why, the appointment to the military academy, of course." This was the first I'd heard about it. I said, "Well, I won't go." And he looked across that table and said, "I think you will." And I said, "Well, if you think I will, then I think I will." But the story behind that, to illustrate how history convolutes on itself. My father, as I said, fancied himself a public speaker and had some political aspirations, which probably, fortunately for the populace, he never fulfilled. Was in a debating society and got crossways with Mr. Thomas Hamer. Almost came to blows. They parted company, didn't speak for years. As it turned out, my father heard, when I was approaching 17, that there was an opening at the academy. The people across the street, the Clarks, Dr. Clark and his family, had a son at the academy. He had failed his exams after the first year, took them again, failed, and was not readmitted. He was a good friend of mine. We were childhood friends. And sadly enough, he left the academy, went west, out of shame, and never returned home. His family never saw him again. Across the road is young Ulyss Grant. My father seized on the opportunity for the academy and sought appointment with the senator. The senator said, "Well, I've made my appointments. Congressman Hamer will make the appointment for your son." My father had to swallow his pride, wrote a letter, extended the olive branch, and Mr. Hamer gladly said, "Yes, I'll be happy to appoint the young man," except he didn't know my name. Now, I'm getting an appointment to the United States Military Academy. The man didn't know my full name. He knew people called me Useless, Ulyss, Liss. So he knew Ulysses was what he thought was my first name. He assumed that my mother's maiden name, Simpson, was my middle name. So that's what he put on the appointment form. On my way to the academy, I was on the boat coming out of New York City, the steamship, with a number of other academy cadets who were telling me that every academy student gets a nickname that is with him, much like a tattoo, for life. I thought, with some consternation, with the initials HUG, the possibilities of what my nickname might be. So when the officer at the enrollment table called my name, he said Ulysses Simpson Grant, and I was standing there waiting, but that wasn't my name. And he called my name again, and I stood there. And then he bellowed at me, my name again, and said, "You, sir, come here, sir." I stepped forward. He said, "Your name is Ulysses Simpson Grant. Why did you not move forward when I called it?" And I said, "Well, actually, my name is Hiram." And he roared and slapped the table and said, "Sir, the United States Army says your name is Ulysses Simpson Grant. And Ulysses Simpson Grant you are. If your parents want to call you Hiram Ulysses Grant, they can go to court and change it." So thereafter, I was Ulysses Simpson Grant. I had no idea that what 19 years later it would mean for those initials. I did not want to go to the academy. The military life held no charms for me. I went. I had about as many 50% demerits as I did merits. Not a good student. I tried to get thrown out. There was legislation at that time to potentially close the academy because it was argued that we were producing a professional military society. I fervently hoped for the passage of that bill, but was disappointed when it was turned down. At one time, I put on my dress uniform, white cross belts, marched out the gate of the academy and down the road to Benny Haven's. Now, Benny Haven ran a tavern, which was strictly off limits. I knew in my heart that going in dress uniform to Benny Haven's would get me thrown out of the academy. I sat there, enjoyed myself. After a long period of time, walked back to the academy in the gates of my dorm. Not a word was ever said. Apparently people assumed I had business there. But after that event, I resolved that I was going to graduate. I thought if that event should ever occur, which I did not anticipate occurring. I did, however, graduate. I was 22nd out of a class of 39. We started out with 75. 39 graduated, class of 1843. I was proudly number 22. I often have told people, as with this august gathering, that if you turn the class rankings upside down, I would be closer to the top. I was not a bad student. I was a voracious reader. I was always in the university library and reading daily. In fact, my senior year, I was elected the chairman of the Literary Society. But I can only remember having read my lessons only once. I never read a lesson more than one time. I was not interested in the military, simply not interested, and wanted nothing to do with it. However, one way or the other, I graduated. Now, two things occurred to me at that academy that I did not know before I went. Because of my rudimentary education, I didn't realize that I was good in math. In fact, I excelled at calculus because the United States Military Academy is an engineering academy. And I found out I really had a talent for math. In fact, I intended to go back and teach math at the university and perhaps have a career as a college teacher teaching math. I also found out that I had quite a talent for art because at that time, since cartography was not an established art or science, we didn't have map makers like we do now during the war. I didn't have a Jed Hotchkiss to draw my maps. We all, as an officer, had to take art class to learn to draw so we could draw our own maps. I found out I'm quite an artist. Worked in watercolor, worked in oils. In fact, some of my paintings to this day hang in the United States Military Academy. So I was quite the artist. Not much of a student. I was recognized then and still as the greatest horseman that ever attended the academy. My senior graduation exercises
I jumped on a horse named York. I made a 6-foot jump. The post is still at the academy where somebody carved in it at the 6-foot mark, Grant on York. So I graduated. Sent to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis, Missouri. 2 things happened there. I met Buck McCullough and I met Julia Dent. Now, Buck was the commanding officer for the officers' mess. Did not like me. Did not like me at all. Not a bit. Never did. Sought out opportunities to embarrass and harass me. But then on the other side of that issue, I met Julia Dent. Fred Dent, her brother, had been my roommate my senior year. He said, I've got a pretty sister you should meet. So when I got to Jefferson Barracks, I went to Whitehaven, a few miles down the road from St. Louis, and I met the Dent family. Well, I didn't meet Julia. I met the other 3 sisters, but not Julia. She was still away at St. Louis in school. When I did meet Julia, she had the smallest hands I ever saw. She was also quite the horseman. 17, very pretty. Had no interest in marrying me. Well, I courted her fervently. Her father didn't like me. In fact, told her that boy's never going to amount to anything, leave him alone. Her mother was something of a visionary and had dreams that could tell the future, and with some bit of accuracy. And she told Julia, you best marry him, he's going to be a big man and very important someday. But father didn't like me and mother did. The Mexican War got in the way. I secretly asked her to marry me, gave her my class ring as an engagement, a pledge of my love, and shipped out with the 4th Regiment to Mexico. There, I was in the Quartermaster Corps. I did not have a combat assignment. I was a brevet lieutenant, not even a full lieutenant because there was no billet for me, so I was an honorary 2nd lieutenant. I always went to the sound of the guns. So when the combat started, I went. I wrote Julia a letter and said, it seems to me that worrying about the shot and the bullets and the shells is much worse than the actual sound of them. Being under fire never bothered me. My fellow officers and troops would be groveling under rocks and logs and everything else that they could find to put between them and the enemy, and I would sit in the open. It never bothered me to be shot at. I was promoted 3 times for bravery, and one particular incident, I took a cannon into a bell tower. Now, in going to the bell tower, we were taking Mexico City. Some Mexican troops were across a wide plaza. I led my troops on a charge and captured them and put them under our control. At that time, we found out they'd already surrendered. That was a blow to my ego. But we turned our attention to some enfilading fire for you civilians, that's crossfire. And our troops were taking quite a beating. I noticed at the San Cosme Convento, which is in Mexico City and still there, there's a bell tower. And I thought we could take a mountain howitzer, now for you civilians, that's a short cannon. We disassembled it to take it up to the bell tower and put it in the bell tower for our enfilading fire into the Mexican troops. The friar there met me at the door. And
it's still on. I see it right there. Right inside the car. Just got it mad.
Sorry about that.
this is my kind of group. So the friar answered the door. And in my Spanish, I learned to speak Spanish very well. I told the friar, we're going upstairs. He said, no, you're not. You're not entering this church. And with all the rifle fire going on in the background and the assault going on and American troops dying. I looked at the father, I pulled back my coat and revealed that dragoon pistol. And I said, I think we will come in. And he said, come in. So we went in, set up a cannon, and opened fire. I was brevetted for bravery for that. I feel like I'm stooping over. Now, and of all people, as the world turns, Braxton Bragg, Pemberton, John Pemberton was sent by General Taylor, or General Scott rather, to come and commend me personally from General Scott for bravery. John C. Pemberton. I met him later. Well, the war's over, we go home. Been 4 years since I've seen Julia. I've ardently written her letters, and she wrote me about one for every 4. Now, what you should know about Julia is, one, first of all, she wasn't that crazy about getting married. She was a young socialite in a family of some social status and wealth, and she didn't want to get engaged or marry a soldier going off to the war that she didn't know if he'd come back or not. Party season was beginning in St. Louis. So we didn't get married, but when I got back, I told her that we were going to get married forthwith. Now, by this time, she has come to the conclusion that she does love me and wanted to marry me. But Julia also had strabismus. Her left eye is crossed almost to the bridge of her nose. So when you see pictures of Julia, you generally see pictures of a profile of her right face. You rarely see one head on. So it was painful for her to write. That's why I didn't get many letters from her, or so she told me. And we told her daddy we're getting married. He relented, and we got married in their townhouse in St. Louis. Now, it may be of interest to you to know that of the men who stood up, I didn't have a best man. We don't have a best man. We have several people who stand up with the groom. And the people who stood up with me were James Longstreet, who was right behind me, actually towering over me. He's Julia's 4th cousin. And Cadmus Wilcox was with us, and another General Clark, or another Cadet Clark. We were all classmates, and they all later have become, in the unpleasant war now, Confederate generals. In fact, Pete Longstreet, when he found out that I got command, had been given General-in-Chief, command of all federal armies, and been made Lieutenant General, when he got the message, he wadded the paper up and threw it on the floor and said, that man will fight us every hour of every day until this war is over. And he was right. Because when the Army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan River at Sudley Ford and Germanna Ford the night of April 30th and May 1st, back in '64, my first campaign in General-in-Chief. Now, you must remember, George Meade was in command of the Army. I had my headquarters with me, but we took 115,000 men across that river in the next 2 days. 115,000 troops. Our supply wagon was 90 miles long. If you put the mule to wagon, they would have stretched from the first wagon going into Richmond while the last wagon was still in Washington City. 60 miles of ammunition and forage, or rather 60 miles of forage and supplies, and 30 miles of ammunition and medical supplies. Ironically, they carried them in the same wagons. But I digress. Julia and I married. Now, this is where some of the rumor about my being a drunk may be addressed. Remember I told you about old Buck and the officer's mess? Well, every time that I would go calling with Julia, of course, being a young man in love, I wanted to stay as long as I could. I'd get my horse and go back into Jefferson Barracks, and I would arrive frequently late for the officer's mess. Buck would deride me in front of the officers' mess, and make me to fine me for being late. He'd make me buy a bottle of wine for the entire officers' mess, and that was expensive. I didn't forget that, but unfortunately, neither did he. Now, years pass, a child, another one on the way. I'm sent to California. Julia can't come because of the trip and the expense. So I go out to California. Now, I wanted to bring my wife. I tried raising sweet potatoes to sell to the miners in the gold rush there, because I was up at Fort Vancouver, British Columbia, or Washington. And then I moved down to Fort Humboldt in California. Well, it rained, the crop flooded. Then I tried with some other offers to get into buying ice to come down from Alaska to sell to gold miners. The ship saw headwinds, dragged in the course. Another ship came in from Hawaii. All of my ice melted. Invested in a boarding house. Several other officers and myself. The man taking the money ran off with the money. So you see, I was never a failure at anything. I just wasn't a success. Now, in 1854, I resigned from the Army. Now, it's rumored that I was drunk at payroll. That never happened. And Buck even said, now he later became a general under my administration. Buck said that never happened. That's just a rumor. It's an untruth, and it never occurred. There's no documentation at all. But I resigned from the Army. Now, I waited until I became a full captain. Now, keep in mind, the Mexican War has been over for 6 years. Making rank in the military, in peacetime military, is glacial at best. But I still made captain in the peacetime Army. So I couldn't have been, I leave it to your judgment, I couldn't have been too incompetent. I made captain. When I made captain, I resigned. But I wanted to make captain because I thought, if I ever need that again, I'd like to go back in the military as a captain at least. When I resigned in April of '54, there were only 50 captains in the entire United States Army. So I'll leave it to your judgment how much of a drunk and a ne'er-do-well that I was. I went back to New York. I tried to borrow some money and got a little bit. Went back to New York, got off the boat, and I was broke. Another myth. I saw Bolivar Buckner, or Simon Buckner. He was in New York City on recruiting duty. He saw me on the street corner, and I told him I couldn't check into a hotel because I had no money at the time. And he said, well, I know the man who owns the hotel. He went in with me, and he guaranteed the innkeeper that I was good for my money. He never loaned me money. That's a myth that somehow got out of control. But Bolivar Buckner never loaned me money. He made sure that I could get into a hotel and guaranteed my bill, but he never had to because I got the money. Well, years pass. We have 4 children, and again, I was never a failure, but I was never a success. Went back to Whitehaven. Mr. Grant gave us 60 acres as a wedding gift, and I went into farming. Well, the first year there's a panic of 1857, and the bottom fell out of the economy, and I couldn't give fruits and vegetables away. Then the next year, heavy rains washed all my crop away. And then I got sick of flare-up of the malaria and couldn't work. So I wrote my father, said I need a job. And he said, well, I've got a job for you out here in the tannery. Come on. So I moved out to Illinois, Galena, Illinois. Now, my father is not happy with me by this time. He said, I fear the Army and military life has ruined Ulysses for work. So I had no desire to be in the tannery of the business, but I had to have a job. So I'm working for my daddy, making $60 a month in the tannery. with intentions of having my own store later, and I'm working with my brothers Orville and Simpson. And so we went along like that for about a year. Now, the rumor, the myth is that we were living in poverty. Actually, we had a 2-story brick house overlooking the river in the nicer section of Galena. And people also seem to think that I'm from Galena. I only lived in Galena about a year and never went back except to visit. But the war started. And Captain Grant, as I was called, I helped drill the militia. I did not get involved. I declined command of the militia. And the volunteers began to be called, and Elihu Root, my advocate, congressman from Galena, tells the governor that you need to get Captain Grant involved. And he did. He offered me captaincy. I declined. Offered me a lieutenant colonelcy. I declined. I felt that I should have at least command of a regiment. I should have at least a colonelcy, or I would not serve. And I bided my time. I did go to Ohio to talk to George McClellan, whom I'd been a classmate with at the academy. Now, McClellan knew I was in the waiting room, and I sat there for 2 full days, and he refused to see me. After 2 days, very disappointed and frankly a little bit brokenhearted, I went back to Illinois. Then the 21st Illinois came along. Volunteers, bad boy regiment, rowdy, ill-disciplined, difficult to maintain. Their colonel was getting drunk with them in the bars at night. They came to the governor and said, well, we like having a good time with him, but we are concerned about going into combat with him. So Root tells the governor, give it a Grant. The governor made me a colonel in the Illinois militia. I had my first regiment command. Now, when we went out to meet the command, John McClernand is with me. Now, he's a name you may not recognize much in history, but I suggest you get familiar with John McClernand, brief as his military exploits were. He was a good friend of President Lincoln and sought every opportunity to tell everybody possible he was good friends with President Lincoln. And he made a stirring hour-long speech to my regiment, with them standing there waiting for him to get through. Not listening to him, waiting for him to get through. I didn't even have a uniform. I was in civilian clothes. I had gone to a store there in Springfield, Illinois, and I had bought a length of yellow ribbon from the clerk. And I tied that yellow ribbon around my waist, borrowed a sword, put the sword in the yellow ribbon, and stood there and held that sword as my symbol of authority, while McClernand ran on and yet on. He turned to me and grandiloquently said, Colonel Grant, they are yours. And I said, dismiss, go to quarters. McClernand was aghast. Our paths crossed again. When the 21st Illinois left Springfield on July the 3rd, 1861, we went to the train station. All the other troops got on the train and went down to Mexico, Missouri, where we were stationed. I marched my troops to Mexico, Missouri. They were disgruntled and unhappy, but I told them, you're going to be doing plenty of walking in the future. You might as well get accustomed to it. And we marched. They still, I understand, proudly claim the title of Grant's Son, though. So, our first taste of combat, which was telling for me, really wasn't combat. We were to clean out an area with a Confederate regiment, went up the hill literally to the campsite in the little valley where they were, and my heart was in my throat, and I knew the men on each side of me could hear my heart pounding. I couldn't even speak. I was so afraid. I wanted to be anywhere but there. But I couldn't stop. So we went to the hill, about to charge into the valley, and they were gone. And I learned a valuable lesson that I never forgot. The enemy was just as afraid of me as I was of him. And I never forgot that. My first battle that I had in conversation here with Trooper Evans, talking about my taking liberties and not obeying orders, I would point out to you, and that's an excellent point. You see, I'm a loose construction person, interpreter. If I'm not told not to do something, then I'm going to do it. Now, Hallett told me to go down there into Kentucky, Columbus, Kentucky, and stay there. Now, I'd sent a colonel over into Missouri with about 3,000 troops. Confederate activity was such that I was afraid they were going to be cut off, and there's a place over there in Belmont that I want to get hold of. I want to meet the troops. We sailed across early in the morning, November morning. I disembarked my 3,000 troops. We advanced on the Confederates. There was a little scuffle, pretty sharp fight, and the Confederates fell back and into the woods. We were safe because Leonidas Polk, the fighting bishop, is yonder way across the riverbank with the wood of Polk, cannon. He's not shelling because he can't hit his own troops. My troops fell into disorder, riding, partying, dancing around, jumping, getting souvenirs, and their officers couldn't get control of them. So I told them, torch the tents and burn the camp. That pretty well stopped them. It was the Confederate artillery coming in that really stopped them. And all the time they're dancing about and losing their discipline, troops by the hundred are coming across the river. They came at us. My officers were ready to surrender. They said, "What shall we do, General? They're all around us." And I said, "You fought your way in, and you're going to fight your way out." And we proceeded to do that. Now, as they get back to the boat, we got 3 boats there at the Mississippi River bank. When they're going back and we get back to the boat, I remember. Now, I would have you know that being a general, and by this time I've been promoted to brigadier general, 1 star, it's a learn as you go job. And nobody had ever commanded as many troops as we were commanding in the war. Well, I had sent, when we hit the riverbank, a colonel south down the riverbank with some troops and told him, if you have any information about Confederate troops coming over to cut us off, come get me. If not, stay here until you're relieved. My soldiers were all getting back on the riverboat. I remember the colonel. I bolted south down that riverbank alone. No escort, nobody with me. As I told you, it was a learn as you go job. I got down a mile or so downriver where the colonel was stationed, and he wasn't there. I noted to speak to him when I got back to the boat. Then I, by this time, have the Confederate force between me and my ships. So I'm just walking my horse. I had on an infantry greatcoat, and I'm walking my horse, and there are Confederate troops within 50 feet of me, that close. I put a cornfield between me and thee, so to speak, and I'm walking my horse on the outside of that cornfield. And then Colonel at that time, later General Red Jackson, says, "There goes the Yankee boys, practice your marksmanship on him." But nobody raised the rifle to fire to him. At this point, though, I realized I was found out, and I bolted for the ship. When I got back to the river, you should know that that had been, December of 1862, had been one of the driest summers on record. And the level of the Mississippi was way down. So banks, which are very sharp anyway, at this time were very sharp and steep. Great drop. My horse must have known the urgency of the situation, because when he got to the riverbank and looked at it almost straight down drop, he put his forelegs down and slid on his haunches down that riverbank. 2 of the boats have already pulled away. The 3rd boat has pulled away. The captain recognized me, cut his engines, and ran the gangplank out, which is about as wide as one of these tables. And that horse rode up that gangplank onto that boat, which is a tribute to my horsemanship, but mainly to the horses wanting to get on the boat. We got on the boat. I went up to the captain's cabin. Now, this has been my first taste of combat as the commanding officer. I went up to the captain's cabin and laid down on the bunk there, the couch that he had in his room. But I was so charged that I couldn't stay down. And Confederate troops were taking shots at us. Remember, it was low water. They were above the ships, shooting down into the ships. So I got up and walked out on the deck to see what was happening, assess the situation. We had pulled away, getting out of their range, and I went back into the cabin, and there was a bullet hole in the wood where my head would have been had I not gotten up. Had gone through the length of the sofa and through the wood. So that was my first taste of command and what can happen in command, and I learned lessons as I went. Now, I'm not a man who talks much, but I would have you know that when I've got something to say, I say it. But I listen much more than I talk. I held one council of war, and that was a mistake, because when my officers advised me to do something, I took the other chores, which I was going to anyway, and it only gained me the enmity of my staff. And they said, well, if you're not going to listen to what we say, why are you asking us? And that was another lesson I learned. I'm the only American general to take the surrender of 3 full armies. I took Buckner at Donelson, and I took Pemberton at Vicksburg, and Lee at Appomattox. No other American general has ever done that. I'm the first lieutenant general, 3 stars, since George Washington. Now, General Winfield Scott had a brevet, an honorary rank of lieutenant general. Congress on February the 30th of 1864, February 29th of 1864, approved my being promoted to lieutenant general with the 3 stars. So I'm the first person since Washington. I'm the first man to initiate the scorched earth policy. General Sherman gets a bad reputation for that, but he was acting under my orders. Perhaps he became enthusiastic about it, but I'm the military leader who said burn it and destroy it so it cannot be subsistence for the troops. I'm the first American general to break away from the Napoleonic thinking that you've got to have a base of supplies. And I was not a member of the Napoleon Club at the United States Military Academy. I scoffed and scorned at Napoleon then. I thought Napoleon was a little individual who just never accomplished much, except that he had great courage and he would do what had not been done before. That was Napoleon's greatest quality. He would do what had not been done before. Another lesson that I learned. But Captain Mahon at the Academy, when he organized the Napoleon Club, did not invite me to come, which says a great deal. I think nothing of Napoleon. But I broke away from a supply base. Now, General Scott had done that in the Mexican War. I took note of that. But I'm the first American general to truly break away and operate in enemy territory without a base of supplies. I'm the first American general to serve in the enemy territory and with the attitude of don't occupy real estate. You shouldn't have to have hundreds of thousands of troops to occupy square miles. If you go after the army and defeat the army, you will win the war. And I'm the first one to act on that. General Henry Halleck actually said at one time that you could win a war and never fire a shot because you could occupy a territory and squeeze the enemy out of it. I did not feel that way. I felt if you cut the head off a snake, you kill the snake. When we went across the river at Bruinsburg, landed at Bruinsburg, the night of April 30th, May 1st and 2nd, that is the largest, see, I made good use of the Navy. That's the largest amphibious military operation until June 6, 1944. Moving my army across the Mississippi River was the largest amphibious operation in history and was such until June the 6th of 1944. I put 50,000 troops across that river in 48 hours. And then I went for Jackson, did Grand Gulf, moved east to Jackson. People thought I was going to go north to Vicksburg. And I didn't want to get caught between two armies. Pemberton was pleading with Johnston, come out of Jackson, hit him. We have a window of opportunity here that we can crush him in detail. But Johnston was already falling back from Jackson. I captured Grand Gulf, moved northeast to Jackson, and then Raymond, Champion Hill, and Big Black, and then into Vicksburg. Now, keep in mind that on May the 2nd, we had Chancellorsville. The war was going badly for the North. I knew when I got the news that if I didn't get out of contact, Halleck was going to call me back across that river and disperse my army all over the Eastern Theater. I did not want that to happen. So, again, I just couldn't be found. I wasn't disobeying orders. I just couldn't be found. We were at the Big Black River watching the troops fall back and federal troops going across the Big Black, and a colonel came riding up to me and said, General Grant, I have communication from General Halleck. I never looked at him. I said, what is that? He said, General Halleck, sir, says you ought to immediately return to Bruinsburg for further orders. And I did look at him at that time, and I turned my head and I said, tell General Halleck his communication was too late. We are already across the Big Black. And then I turned back to Sherman and began resume my conversation. And I haven't seen or heard that officer say anything else, even until this day. But we did many things and we accomplished many things in the war. But I will tell you this, the Confederate troops did not lose the war because they couldn't fight. It was their leadership at the presidential level. And I will leave you with this. I hope that if a history of this war is written, it will be a true history. For such a history will accurately reflect the courage, the endurance, and the quality of the American citizen soldier, regardless of what region of the country he hails from, or in whose ranks he fought.
The general wanted me to announce that if anybody has a problem with him, you're carrying his picture in your wallet, $50 bill, he'll be glad to trade you a couple of Jeffersons for it.
All right, thank you.